Was Moscow supposed to be untouchable, or was that belief always a carefully maintained illusion waiting to collapse? In the early hours of late December, the answer arrived not through official statements, but through air raid sirens, grounded aircraft, and the glow of explosions reflected on the glass facades of Russia's most guarded capital. For years, the Kremlin cultivated the image of Moscow as a fortress shielded by layered air defenses, far removed from the war-consuming Ukraine. That image fractured in a single night. As waves of Ukrainian drones pushed deep into Russian airspace, Moscow's airports became the first visible symbols of failure. Vnukovo, Domodedovo, Zhukovsky, and Sheremetyevo all shut down in rapid succession. Departure boards bled red cancellations. Flights halted mid-taxi. Thousands of passengers, families, workers, holiday travelers were forced onto terminal floors, warned to stay away from windows as air defense intercepts thundered overhead. This was not a routine disruption. It was a capital city momentarily cut off from the world. The shock was not limited to inconvenience. The paralysis of Moscow's airspace sent a far more dangerous signal. Russia's air defense network, built to reassure elites and deter adversaries, was struggling against swarms of low-cost, long-range drones. Even when intercepted debris raining over suburban districts created panic-forcing emergency shutdowns. The effect was cumulative. Each explosion, successful or not, triggered further closures, amplifying chaos through fear rather than firepower. Here is the uncomfortable question viewers should be asking early: if Moscow cannot guarantee basic air safety, what does that mean for cities closer to the front lines, or for the Russian economy that depends on uninterrupted mobility? This was not Ukraine striking symbols for headlines alone. The operation exposed how fragile centralized systems become when pressure is applied simultaneously and persistently. This was not the first warning. Earlier in December, a coordinated drone wave forced the cancellation of hundreds of flights across northern Russia. Authorities framed it as a temporary disruption, but repetition transforms accidents into patterns. By Christmas week, the pattern was undeniable. Airports, once marketed as symbols of modern Russia, resembled emergency shelters. Their luxury storefronts turned into silent corridors of uncertainty. The Kremlin's dilemma became visible in real time. Each incoming drone forced a decision: activate expensive interceptor missiles or risk impact, close airspace and halt economic activity, or gamble with civilian safety. Either choice carried a cost. Western analysts have repeatedly noted that modern air defenses are not optimized to counter mass drone saturation indefinitely. The Moscow events confirmed this assessment under live conditions. Behind the scenes, NATO planners and Western defense ministries were watching closely. The implications stretched far beyond Russia. If cheap drones could neutralize airspace over one of the world's most defended capitals, military doctrines across Europe and North America would need urgent recalibration. The cost-exchange ratio, drones versus interceptors, was suddenly impossible to ignore. For ordinary Russians, however, doctrine meant little compared to lived experience. War had crossed an invisible boundary. It was no longer something watched on television or discussed in abstract terms. It arrived as cold floors, endless delays, and the realization that even Moscow was no longer insulated. And if the capital could be shaken this easily, what other pillars were already cracking beneath the surface? The answer begins far beyond the airports, inside factories, refineries, and supply chains, now burning hundreds of kilometers from Red Square, where the real damage was only just beginning. If the shutdown of Moscow's airports symbolized shock, what followed across the Russian Federation revealed something far more dangerous: systemic paralysis. Within hours, disruptions rippled outward from the capital, turning what officials initially framed as temporary security measures into a nationwide breakdown of mobility, logistics, and confidence. Airspace closures stretched far beyond Moscow, grounding flights across multiple regions and leaving tens of thousands stranded in terminals from central Russia to the south. The scale mattered. More than 400 flights were canceled nationwide during the first major wave, with Moscow alone accounting for well over 100 grounded departures. Screens filled with cancellation codes, crews timed out. Aircraft sat idle on frozen tarmacs. Each hour of delay multiplied losses, not just for airlines but for cargo operators. exporters and supply chains already strained by sanctions and wartime disruption. Aviation analysts note that even short-term airspace closures can trigger cascading logistical failures, particularly in an economy as geographically vast as Russia's. This was no longer about drones in the sky. It was about how fear and uncertainty can immobilize a modern state faster than physical destruction. Insurance premiums spiked immediately. Airspace risk classifications were quietly revised. For international carriers and logistics firms, Russia began to resemble an unstable transit zone rather than a predictable market. These shifts rarely make headlines, but their economic impact compounds relentlessly. The viewer should pause here and ask, how long can a war economy function when its internal arteries are repeatedly severed even temporarily? Russia's wartime logistics depend on synchronized movement fuel shipments, industrial components, personnel rotations. Each shutdown, even if measured in hours, disrupts schedules that take weeks to realign. Multiply that across regions and the strain becomes structural. The repetition was critical. This was not a single dramatic night, but a pattern unfolding across December. Earlier attacks had already forced airports into emergency mode, transforming terminals into improvised shelters. By the later wave, the response appeared less coordinated, more reactive. Warnings blared through loudspeakers. Passengers were instructed to avoid windows and security corridors filled with anxious crowds. Explosions audible miles away echoed inside terminals, reinforcing the sense that control was slipping. From a strategic perspective, this paralysis served Ukraine's broader objective, exhausting Russia's capacity to absorb disruption. Western military analysts have long emphasized that modern conflict is as much about degrading systems as destroying assets. Saturation tactics using numerous inexpensive drones force defenders into impossible trade-offs. Fire interceptors and bleed resources or conserve missiles and risk penetration. Either choice weakens long-term resilience. NATO observers, according to defense reporting, are studying these events as a live demonstration of how civilian infrastructure becomes a strategic pressure point. Airports are not just transport hubs. They are psychological anchors. When they fail, public confidence erodes rapidly. For authoritarian systems reliant on stability narratives, this erosion is especially dangerous. Inside, Russia official messaging struggled to keep pace. Silence alternated with vague reassurances. But images told a different story. Crowded terminals, people sleeping on floors, luggage piled beside families, unsure when or how they would leave. This was 21st century disruption unfolding in real-time broadcast through smartphones and social media before sensors could react. As the airspace crisis spread, it became clear that the drones were only the opening act. The real target lay deeper, the industrial and energy backbone that sustains both Russia's economy and its war effort. And once those pillars were struck, the paralysis would move from inconvenience to irreversible damage. Once mobility was disrupted, the strikes moved decisively towards something far more consequential, Russia's industrial heart. This was where inconvenience turned into structural damage. Precision attacks targeted facilities that form the backbone of Russia's war economy, plants that do not merely support civilian life, but directly feed missile production, fuel logistics, and advanced weapons manufacturing. The message was unmistakable. The rear no longer exists. One of the most consequential hits landed in the Tula region, less than 200 kilometers from Moscow. There, a synthetic rubber and chemical complex critical to Russia's defense industry was struck repeatedly. This facility plays a central role in producing polybutadiene and other compounds used in solid rocket fuel tires for military vehicles and components for missile systems. Multiple explosions were recorded, fires burned uncontrollably, and production was halted. Even temporary shutdowns at such a node create cascading consequences across the military-industrial chain. The audience should consider this carefully. How many missiles can be launched when the chemicals that power them stop flowing? In modern warfare, factories are as decisive as battalions. Western defense analysts have repeatedly emphasized that Russia's advantage lies in scale, not flexibility. When a key plant goes offline, alternatives are limited, repairs are slow, and substitution is often impossible due to sanctions and lack of Western technology. The strikes did not stop there. Ukraine's campaign expanded southward, targeting energy infrastructure with surgical intent. Refineries in Rostov and Saratov regions, critical to fuel production for both civilian transport and frontline units, were hit in rapid succession. Fires lit the night sky, visible from kilometers away. Authorities issued minimal statements, but the smoke told its own story. Each refinery disrupted meant fewer liters of diesel reaching armored units, fewer tankers supplying logistics hubs, and higher domestic fuel stress. This is where economic damage begins to mirror military impact. Russia may be one of the world's largest oil producers, but refining capacity is the choke point. Crude without processing is useless to tanks, trucks, and aircraft. Analysts warn that sustained pressure on refineries forces painful trade-offs: export fuel for hard currency or prioritize domestic military consumption. Either choice carries political and economic costs. Further west, petrochemical facilities supplying polymers and composites, materials essential for drone production, were also engulfed in flames. These are not easily replaceable inputs. Drone warfare has become central to both sides of the conflict, and shutting down polymer production directly constrains Russia's ability to scale unmanned systems. NATO observers have highlighted this as a classic example of asymmetric warfare, striking upstream production to limit downstream battlefield options. The strategic logic was clear. Ukraine was not chasing spectacle. It was dismantling cycles of production. Every destroyed reactor, storage tank, or processing unit removed weeks or months of output. Repairs require imported components Russia can no longer freely access. Even when fixes are possible, they divert skilled labor and capital from other priorities. From a NATO and Western perspective, these strikes reinforced a critical lesson. Industrial resilience is the true center of gravity in prolonged conflict. Russia's factories, once thought safely beyond reach, were now exposed. And if facilities near Moscow could burn, no industrial zone could be considered secure. What began as drones over airports had evolved into a systematic campaign against the foundations of Russia's war-making capacity. The question looming now was not whether Russia could respond militarily, but whether its economy could absorb the damage without fracturing from within. As factories burned and refineries went dark, the consequences spread into the most vulnerable layer of any modern military campaign: logistics. This was the phase where destruction translated into immobilization. Without fuel, ammunition, and functioning transport hubs, even the largest army becomes static. Ukraine's strikes were now exposing how fragile Russia's logistical web truly was. Once key nodes were removed, ports and depots became the next pressure points. In southern Russia, critical fuel storage and export terminals were hit, triggering massive fires and forcing emergency shutdowns. One port facility essential for transferring petroleum products and military supplies toward Crimea and occupied southern Ukraine was rendered inoperable. Firefighting efforts stretched for days, tying up resources and drawing attention away from other vulnerable sites. The loss of even one such hub forces supply routes to reroute through fewer, more predictable corridors, making them easier targets. This is where the strategic math turns brutal. Russian armored units consume enormous quantities of fuel daily. Tanks without fuel are not weapons. They are liabilities. Western military analysts estimate that a single tank battalion can burn through tens of thousands of liters of fuel in continuous operations. When refineries are damaged and ports are closed, the gap between supply and demand widens rapidly. Fuel shortages do not announce themselves immediately at the front, but when they arrive, operations slow, rotations stall, and tactical options shrink. The audience should ask what happens to an army built en masse when movement becomes a luxury. This is precisely the dilemma Ukraine appears intent on creating. By striking behind the lines, far from trenches and artillery duels, it forces Russia to fight physics and economics at the same time. The logistical crisis extends beyond fuel. Ammunition depots and distribution centers were also targeted, disrupting the flow of rocket shells and spare parts. Even when stockpiles survive, moving them safely becomes increasingly difficult under constant threat. Every convoy requires air defense cover. Every rerouted shipment adds time and exposure. The cost of protecting logistics begins to rival the cost of the weapons themselves. From a NATO perspective, these developments carry significant implications. Alliance planners have long emphasized the importance of resilience and redundancy in supply chains. Russia's experience demonstrates what happens when redundancy is limited and infrastructure is centralized. The strikes revealed that depth, once a cornerstone of Russian military doctrine, has eroded. When long-range drones can reach deep into the rear, the concept of a safe logistics zone collapses. Inside Russia, the economic effects compounded the military strain. Fuel disruptions translated into rising prices at the pump, increased transportation costs, and pressure on food distribution across vast distances. The Russian central bank's high interest rates offered little relief. Inflation combined with stagnation, classic wartime stagflation, tightened the screws on an already stressed population. Meanwhile, NATO states and the United States were watching not just the damage, but the method. The campaign illustrated how targeting logistics yields outsized effects compared to battlefield engagements alone. It was a reminder that wars are often decided far from the front lines in places most civilians never see. As supply lines narrowed and pressure mounted, Russia faced a dilemma with no easy exit. Protect logistics and leave cities exposed, or shield cities and let the front starve. This trade-off was becoming unavoidable, and its consequences would soon extend beyond material loss into the psychological core of the Russian state. As logistical strain intensified, the most destabilizing effects emerged not from burning infrastructure, but from inside Russia's own social and elite structures. This was the phase where fear replaced confidence and silence replaced loyalty. For years, the Kremlin's authority rested on an unspoken promise: stability at home in exchange for political obedience. That promise was now visibly eroding. For ordinary citizens, the shift was deeply personal. Sleeping on airport floors in Moscow, breathing smoke from industrial fires in regional cities, and waking to explosions far from any front line shattered the psychological boundary that had long insulated daily life. War was no longer distant. It was present in kitchens, commutes, and family conversations. This erosion of perceived safety is not easily reversed. Western sociologists and security analysts note that once civilians feel directly exposed, trust in centralized authority declines rapidly, even if public dissent remains muted. The audience should ask a critical question here. How long can a system built on fear maintain control once fear turns inward? Authoritarian stability depends on predictability. The drone strikes introduced uncertainty into spaces previously considered untouchable. That uncertainty spreads faster than physical damage. Inside elite circles, the reaction was even more corrosive. Business leaders, senior bureaucrats, and military commanders began to face a new calculus. If Moscow itself could be penetrated, personal security could no longer be assumed. Reports from financial monitoring agencies and leaked market data suggested renewed efforts by wealthy Russians to move assets abroad despite restrictions. Quiet contingency planning, alternative residences, foreign passports, discreet family relocations accelerated behind closed doors. This dynamic creates a dangerous feedback loop. Elites who sense instability become risk-averse. Bad news stops traveling upward. Decision-makers operate in informational fog precisely when clarity is most needed. Western intelligence assessments have long warned that such environments increase the risk of strategic miscalculation. Silence in this context is not loyalty, it is self-preservation. Within the military hierarchy, the pressure was equally severe. Commanders faced operational shortages while being asked to project confidence. Failures in air defense and logistics could not be openly acknowledged without consequences. The result was paralysis. No one wanted to be the bearer of uncomfortable truths. This atmosphere where accountability is replaced by fear has historically preceded major breakdowns in centralized systems. NATO analysts watching the situation have drawn comparisons to late-stage Soviet dynamics when outward strength masked internal decay. The difference now is speed. Information travels faster. Images of chaos spread instantly. The state cannot fully control the narrative when reality intrudes so visibly. Psychological damage also carries military consequences. Morale is a finite resource. When soldiers know that factories behind them are burning and families at home are exposed, confidence erodes. The sense of fighting for a secure homeland weakens when that homeland feels increasingly unsafe. By this stage, the campaign had achieved more than physical destruction. It had injected doubt into every layer of Russian society, from passengers in terminals to generals in offices. And once doubt takes hold, it becomes a strategic weapon in its own right. The question looming now was whether this internal fracture would remain contained, or whether it would accelerate as military, economic, and diplomatic pressures converged into a single strategic trap. By the final phase of this campaign, the individual crises, airspace shutdowns, industrial fires, fuel shortages, and elite anxiety had merged into a single strategic bind with no clean exit. This was no longer a question of tactical losses. It was a convergence of military, economic, and geopolitical pressure that narrowed the Kremlin's room for maneuver to near zero. Militarily, the dilemma was stark. To protect Moscow and other major cities, Russia had to concentrate air defense assets around population centers. But every system pulled back from the front left troops in Ukraine, more exposed to drones, missiles, and precision strikes. Western defense experts have repeatedly warned that air defense is a finite resource, not a shield that can be everywhere at once. Ukraine's campaign forced Russia to confront this reality daily. Protect the rear and the front bleeds. Protect the front and the capital burns. From NATO's perspective, this was a textbook example of strategic overstretch. Alliance analysts observed that Ukraine was effectively dictating where Russia had to defend rather than reacting to Russian initiatives. This inversion of initiative is decisive in long wars. It drains resources asymmetrically and forces the defender into constant improvisation. For Western planners, it reinforced the importance of distributed defense redundancy and resilience lessons, with direct implications for NATO's own posture. Economically, the trap tightened further. Damage to refineries, ports, and high-tech industrial facilities undercut Russia's export capacity at the worst possible moment. Insurance companies quietly reclassified key Russian regions as high-risk zones. Shipping costs rose. Energy customers grew wary of unreliable deliveries. Russia's attempt to pivot exports toward Asia faced new obstacles as buyers demanded deeper discounts to offset risk. Analysts estimate that Russia has already been forced to sell oil at significant reductions, eroding hard currency earnings needed to sustain the war. This pushed Moscow into deeper dependence on a narrow set of partners. China and Iran emerged as critical suppliers of components, drones, and spare parts. But this was not partnership on equal terms. Beijing in particular approached the situation transactionally, providing limited assistance while extracting favorable pricing and political leverage. Strategic autonomy, long touted by the Kremlin, began to look increasingly hollow. Diplomatically, the image damage was profound. Repeated disruptions at Moscow's airports and Black Sea ports undermined Russia's claim to reliability as a global trade partner. For international investors and logistics firms, perception matters as much as data. Russia began to resemble a permanent risk zone rather than a stable power. This erosion of credibility is slow to reverse and compounds over time. For viewers, the key question is, can a state sustain a long war when its rear is no longer secure? Its economy is bleeding efficiency, and its elites are quietly hedging against collapse. History suggests such situations rarely end through sudden defeat. They unravel through exhaustion. As 2025 approaches, the strategic forecast grows darker for Moscow. Each new strike forces painful trade-offs. Each month of disruption weakens resilience. Meanwhile, Ukraine's ability to project power deep into Russian territory reshapes assumptions across NATO and beyond. The explosions that echoed across Russia were not just attacks on infrastructure. They were signals of vulnerability, of shifting initiative, and of a system under mounting strain. Whether this pressure culminates in negotiated settlement, internal fracture, or prolonged attrition remains uncertain. One thing is clear: the war has irreversibly changed. And the question now facing both Russia and the West is not whether the conflict can be contained, but how much more damage will be absorbed before the balance finally breaks. Over the course of these 6 sections, a clear pattern has emerged. What began as drone strikes disrupting Moscow's airspace evolved into a systemic campaign, targeting Russia's industrial base, energy infrastructure, logistics networks, and psychological stability. Airports turned into shelters, factories critical to missile and drone production, burned fuel supply lines tightened, and ports essential for exports were knocked offline. Together, these blows expose the fragility behind Russia's image of depth and invulnerability. Strategically, Ukraine has demonstrated an ability to impose costs far beyond the front lines, forcing Russia into impossible trade-offs between defending cities and sustaining battlefield operations. Economically, refinery damage, rising insurance costs, and discounted energy exports are accelerating long-term strain. Politically and psychologically, fear has crept into both civilian life and elite decision-making circles, eroding confidence from within. Looking ahead, the likely trajectory is not sudden collapse but mounting exhaustion. NATO and Western observers are already adapting doctrine based on these lessons, while Russia faces increasing dependence on a shrinking set of partners. So here is the central question. If war has reached the heart of Russia, can the Kremlin still sustain the promise of stability it was built upon? Or has that promise already been broken? If you found this analysis valuable, consider subscribing and turning on notifications for more in-depth breakdowns of the conflict's evolving dynamics.